We are hearing from people inside prisons after Derek Chauvin was found guilty on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter in the murder of George Floyd. Yukari Kane of the Prison Journalism Project and Richard Richardson, the former executive editor of San Quentin News, join us now. And the Prison Journalism Project has published long stories about incarcerated people's reactions to the Chauvin verdict. Yukari, can you tell us about some of those reactions?
Yeah, so when the verdict was announced, we sent out requests to all of our writers for dispatches about what the word was inside, and I found them to be really nuanced and sometimes surprising as well. There was, of course, most people felt like justice was served and that it was the right decision. But there was also a lot of reflection about the fact that we can't forget that George Floyd had died and that others have died. There was a lot of remembrance about Breonna Taylor and others. And there was a lot of hope that it would lead to meaningful reform.
And Richard, you were released from San Quentin just before the verdict was reached. Can you share what some of the conversations were like and feelings were like from when George Floyd was killed to when Derek Chauvin went on trial?
Yes, sir. So it was very emotional, because a lot of us put ourselves in George Floyd's position, as being on the other end of the law enforcement. However, it's hard to kind of straddle that fence watching a police officer be placed in the same position that was placed in and going through trial, and going through this criminal justice process. And as we all know, that criminal justice process is flawed, but you get some satisfaction of knowing that somebody is going to pay for the actual murder of George Floyd. But this is a long standing issue that's been going on in America for quite some time now. So it's bittersweet, but we know that going through trial and being convicted, it's not the answer to or the silver bullet to all the problems that have been going on in the United States for centuries.
I had a conversation with a young brother. He's in his early 30s, and he said, "You know what? I forgive Chauvin," and it reflects on the African American brothers and sisters we have all over. They're very, very gracious. And I was stunned by it. I said, why? And he said, I don't know. I just can't see someone spending the rest of their lives in prison. And because he himself is, sentenced to basically die in prison. So I was stunned by that point.
Yes, many have said the work continues after this verdict, even still.
Really, the thing that astounded me during the whole course of the trial is those of us that were interested in the trial, we would just really talk about how awesome the prosecution was. We all have our own horror stories about being over-prosecuted and, the prosecutor is the enemy. But here we are watching this. It's just so funny to think of all these incarcerated people and we're like totally buying into the prosecution.
And Yukari, multiple corrections officers share their varied perspectives on the verdict. Can you share what they said?
Yeah, first of all, we were very surprised and impressed that our writers were able to get corrections officers and prison staff on the record. But it seemed like there was some dividing along the lines of color. Black officers were satisfied with the verdict, and white officers, some of the more extreme comments was that Derek Chauvin was just doing his job.
This one particular officer, his just hate towards George Floyd. I talked to him, and I did not ask him about George Floyd. I just asked him, what do you think about the guilty verdict? Instead of, giving me something about the guilty verdict or some technicality or thinking like, this was a travesty, he literally destroyed the character of George Floyd. I can't tell you this over the phone, but he basically, considered him to be a subhuman and that he deserved to get what he got. And that thing in itself, and I've heard a lot of things in my life in here, that thing bothered me, and it bothers me almost from the time I've heard it. And I think it will stay with me for the rest of my life because the callousness it was just apparent. If I could just show that to the entire country, that will sum it all.
And some might wonder this. What do you think the prison experience will be like for Chauvin as a former officer now behind bars?
Well, I could start, and Richard could I'm sure provide a lot of perspective as well. A lot of our writers had pretty mixed feelings about this in terms of what he was going to face. Some of our writers said that he was most likely going to be in isolation, and having been in solitary for long extended periods of time, that they wouldn't wish it on their worst enemy.
In addition to saying that they wanted to see Chauvin cry, a lot of people were saying, like, someone's going to get that guy now real quickly. Like, he ain't going to make it too long. The first chance someone gets, they're going to stab him. So those are all factors when you think about why solitary. Any law enforcement person that gets convicted would probably opt for solitary just so that there's no chance of getting hurt.
One writer said that, he was very satisfied with the verdict. He was happy about it, but he was also, it was complicated because he also felt sympathetic. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yes, I don't want to dance on the razor blade here, but as you look at both sides of the fence, a police officer going to prison, and facing a lot of people who is really kind of upset with law enforcement agencies right now, especially those people who are incarcerated. His safety is really going to be in jeopardy. So yes, I can see him doing a lot of isolation time, but at the same time, you have a majority of prisoners or people who are incarcerated that's going to say he's going to get what he deserves, and that's on a violent aspect of what happens in prison to police officers. I don't necessarily agree with that ideology, but it's like I said, I can look at both sides of the fence.
And given that he's placed in isolation, and given what he's found guilty of, do you think that's preferential treatment?
When you say preferential treatment, isolation, personally, I don't think is good for anyone, regardless of what kind of crime you committed.
Yukari and Richard, thank you very much for your insight.